noticing that Jungian writers keep mentioning supranatural, and it never clicked on me what they were talking about. It always hit me in the face because I always have thought, and everybody pretty much thinks, I think, of God as supernatural. And but then it finally clicked on me that God isn't supernatural at all. God is supranatural. And that was Jung's point all along. And so it's about understanding ourselves. I mean, if God were supernatural, we would have seen him in the Hubble telescope by now, or we would have seen him in CERN, in the down to the level of the Higgs boson. But so far, neither of those places have we seen God. So God is not in the physical world as we know him, or as we know it. So God has to be somewhere else, and that somewhere else is in us. And that's the rub, I think. But I was listening to a conversation today between Paul Vanderklay. Paul Vanderklay was doing the video, and it was he was commenting on a video between a man named I think it's Alistair McGrath, and Brett Weinstein, and that got my attention. So that's why I wanted to do this talk tonight. And so this chart, I'm going to put it up and share it for all participants so that everybody knows what we're talking about, or what I'm talking about. And it might jar you if you're not used to thinking of the world in this way. But Dr. Jung made this series of equivalencies in a letter that he wrote. And so I want to read a portion of that letter, and I'm going to take that off for now. So the letter is in this book, The New God Image by Edward Edinger, and I'm on page 187. And this is a letter that Dr. Jung wrote to the Reverend David Cox on September 25th, 1957. And I'll just read a short excerpt from this letter. Okay, in order to accomplish his task, man is inspired by the Holy Ghost in such a way that he is apt to identify him with his own mind. He even runs the grave risk of believing he has a messianic mission, and therefore forces tyrannous doctrines upon his fellow beings. He would do better to disidentify his mind from the small voice within, from dreams and fantasies through which the divine spirit manifests itself. One should listen to the inner voice attentively, intelligently, and critically, because the voice one hears is the influx of the divine, consisting, as the Acts of John aptly state, of right and left streams of opposites. They have to be clearly separated so that their positive and negative aspects become visible. Only thus can we take up a middle position and discover a middle way. That is the task left to man, and that is the reason why man is so important to God, that he decided to become a man. Although all this sounds as if it were a sort of theological speculation, it is really modern man's perplexity expressed in symbolic terms. It is the problem I so often had to deal with in treating the neuroses of intelligent patients. It can be expressed in a more scientific, psychological language. For instance, instead of using the term God, you say unconscious. Instead of Christ, self. Instead of incarnation, integration of the unconscious. Instead of salvation or redemption, individuation. Instead of crucifixion or sacrifice on the cross, realization of the four functions or of wholeness. I think it is no disadvantage to religious tradition if we can see how far it coincides with psychological experience. On the contrary, it seems to me a most welcome aid to understanding religious traditions. Okay, so that's sort of the gauntlet thrown down. And so I'll put this share up here again for a bit. And perhaps we can have a discussion about this. Now, in this equivalency, let's talk about what is being said here. When Dr. Jung refers to God as the unconscious, we have to remember that what he's talking about is his definition of God is this: God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. Okay, so the way I saw this the way it struck home to me was a few years ago, I guess it was 2 years ago now. I was driving back from up in near Boston, where one of my daughters lives, and we had to drive all night from 5 p.m. till 3 a.m. to get back to our home. And while we're driving along, it suddenly dawned on me that we are entirely dependent on forces that are way beyond our control. And so in terms of the driving regulations, all I could see during that drive coming down Interstate 95 was red taillights ahead of me and white headlights coming at me. But I had no idea what the psychological state or the state of inebriation or the skill of the drivers that were coming at me and all that time. And of course, we're at the mercy of those sorts of issues every day when we go out on the highway, because we don't know what we're getting into. I mean, we have a certain level where the government can make a rule that says, okay, we're going to have a stoplight at this intersection and it's going to work in this fashion. But we're dependent on a whole lot of unconscious factors if we're going to drive. And so prayer is appropriate. But in this context, what I'm saying is not defend me from the other drivers, God, but let me be as alert as possible so that neither I will be killed in an automobile accident, nor will I kill anyone else, okay? Because the God that we're talking about is a God that's within us. And in turn, that's the God that we can pray to, okay? Because that's the unconscious self. And so we can make that petition to our own self to be alert on a drive like that, or on any occasion where we go out and drive. We're dependent, on everything from automobile manufacturers to county legislatures, et cetera, et cetera. And there's nothing that we can do about that. And there's nothing much God can do about it in the event when you're actually doing it. But you can petition your own self, your own unconscious, to be alert. And hopefully you will be.
Well, I think this has to be an act of will, doesn't it? In terms of you consciously at first, you have to think about that because you're trying to listen to the messages of your unconscious. Most of the time, I don't think we really do that. We're just kind of a victim of not even paying attention to maybe the messages we get because they're, of a different language, so to speak. They're feeling, They're feeling,
or they're a vision.
Yeah, or an intuition, something like that.
But I mean, there have been several occasions when, something in my unconscious made me swerve at a point where if I hadn't swerved, I would have been in an accident. But something came to my aid. Okay. And that's the God that's supernatural. It's at such depth that we can't even touch it. We can't even touch that God.
But it's also a proof that to you and to other people that have experienced this is that that's something that we're not, it comes to us and we believe it because we've experienced it.
Absolutely, right. But I think most drivers have. Another thing that you might have experienced is when you're driving on a long trip like that, it's very common to be thinking about something else. Your mind isn't on the tail lights in front of you. You're basically in a state of hypnotism, and you're thinking about something else, whether it's the baseball game that your kid lost yesterday, or wasn't that a beautiful opera I attended, or whatever it is that you're thinking about as you're going down the road. And there is some unconscious part of you that's keeping you on the road, keeping you safe, causing you to pay attention when your attention is needed, when your conscious attention is needed. So you notice something that takes you out of that trance, and it alerts you to something that you have to do consciously. You can't drive all the time unconsciously, but many of us do drive unconsciously, I think, a lot of the time. And I certainly admit that myself.
Yeah, I remember this lady told me one time she was driving along and she pulled in her driveway. She was following a car and she pulled in her driveway, she thought, and she just pulled into the guy's driveway that she was following. Surprise.
And that, anyway, that God is extremely powerful. And in the context of Dr. Jung's definition, now, normally we don't certainly need a supernatural being because there is none, but that supernatural being we also don't focus on. And as long as everything's going along hunky-dory, you don't need God. You don't need to refer to this thing that we all human beings have called gods for the last, 10,000 years at least, maybe longer than that. Any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Carl.
I have a question.
Sure.
You were saying you can ask God to help you be the most alert while you're driving. to prevent accidents and whatnot. And Jerome, you had mentioned obviously to pay attention is a conscious action, and God is unconscious. But I wonder, does God set the decide what he or she shows us, or if, for instance, if I petition God, I'm talking to my unconscious, I might have a vision in a flash or something, and
Right.
does the unconscious, I think, likes to be asked for its guidance.
Yeah, surely that's true.
So, like, maintaining a relationship with it probably put you. I'm not sure, but maybe it's going to be more willing to want to help you if you're maintaining that relationship.
Right, and that's the huge problem that we have in society at large, because we have dissociated from that self, that being that's deep in us, and which is really the boss. I mean, it's the psychological center that's the boss of our lives, and it's the part of us that determines what we will be in our lives. There's no God. Jordan Peterson likes Pinocchio, but there's no God out there that's pulling your strings. The God that's pushing you into doing things is in your psyche. And so, this is the standard picture of the football player who points to the heavens when he makes a touchdown. But really, if that young man is a religious man, which he obviously would be, his prayers were really to his unconscious to push him through all the exercises and running that he had to do to prepare himself, and the training that he had to do to prepare himself so he could make that touchdown. It wasn't Geppetto there pulling the strings to make it work on the day. So the prayer that should be is a prayer to the self to perform as well as you can do. And it's interesting to me that I was naturally doing this when I was in high school, and I didn't realize it, but I remember when I was going to school to take a test, for example, I would say a little prayer, and the little prayer was, Almighty Heavenly Father, please guide me to do my best on this examination today. And that's a petition to ask my unconscious to pour it out. But I didn't realize that. I mean, I thought I was talking to Almighty Heavenly Father Geppetto, but it's not that. It's something in the self. And so.
Well, I think Carl's hit on one of the pillars of Jungian psychology is we need to establish a relationship to the unconscious because it feels neglected if you don't do that.
Right.
And that's really, if you read all of Jung in terms of the relationships between the opposites, it's one opposite is either too strong and one is neglected, and we don't get a balance between the two. So that is the pillar, is to reestablish that communication.
Right. And that, who's really good at that? All the religions. Right.
Yay.
Right. And so PC here says the unconscious is the master trickster. Well, yes, the unconscious is both the trickster and the good Mercurius, both. There's two streams. We live in two worlds, and they are both this one. Let's see. Unshaken says, Memory Streams and Reflections is one of the best books I've read in a long time. And there's a great audio book about Memory Streams Reflections, too. So the next point, and we can come back to this, but so the next point in our little exercise here is Christ equals the self, okay? And what Jung means by this is that each one of us has a destiny. And so Christ was basically the perfect example of this destiny, basically. And I got put off one of Dr. Jung's books, Ion, for about a decade, because in chapter 5 of Ion, Dr. Jung says Christ as an example of the self, but that's what he is. That is what he is. But it's a continuing revelation to me that I've been looking at this so long, and yet the penny finally dropped only today that when they're using supranatural instead of supernatural, they're talking about the psyche is the primordial being that we are, and we've all lost contact with that. And so one of the issues that we have is that our religions are being misused, okay, politically. And so in this context, there's a pastor, wait a minute, let me see if I can find my reference to him. Okay, there's a pastor from North Carolina named John Pavlovitz, and I think I can share this with you. I'm going to try. So John Pavlovitz started a blog some time ago, and let me go back up to the top of his blog here. The kind of Christian I refuse to be, and this is a photograph of him. I assume you can see this. Can you not?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So John Pavlovitz wrote The Kind of Christian He Refused to Be, and by going through the things that he refuses in terms of Christianity, we can see the ways that our politics has been warping religion, and in inappropriate ways. And so John Pavlovitz is now out on the speaking trail himself, but here's what he says. I refuse to be a Christian who lives in fear of people who look or speak or worship differently than I do. And, you know, this actually comes up in Paul Vanderklay's talk today, and almost every time he makes a video, he's dissing one religion or another part of faith traditions. Even in his interview with me, he was making a distinction between the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church in America. And the issue is that all of these systems have provided the transcendent function, the connection between the unconscious and the conscious. Then he says, I refuse to be a Christian who believes that God blesses America more than God so loves the world. And obviously that's a reference to John 3:16. And he says, I refuse to be a Christian who can't find the beauty and truth in religious traditions other than my own. And I think that that's one of the key things that we have to find is we have to turn back toward one another and see what's right in other people's ways of communicating through the transcendent function. And I refuse to be a Christian who uses the Bible to perpetuate individual or systematic bigotry, racism, or sexism. And obviously that's critical issue in our politics, and shame on all the popes for failing to get it that celibacy doesn't work and you need another approach. And instead of that, we have continuing problems with the priests of the Catholic Church abusing their congregants. And that's a problem, by the way, in many other religions as well. I learned this week that the one about religious traditions other than my own, apparently there's a big controversy up at Friends Central because it's a Quaker school, but it has tried to push out a couple of speakers who are Muslim. And all right, so going on here, I refuse to be a Christian who treasures allegiance to a flag or a country or a political party over emulating Jesus. And of course, there have been a lot of ideas that have come up in our politics that are supposedly Christian, but are not. Then I refuse to be a Christian who is reluctant to call out the words of hateful preachers, venomous politicians, and mean-spirited pew sitters in the name of keeping ceremonial Christian unity. Okay, he's got it. I refuse to be a Christian who tolerates a global church where all people are not openly welcomed, fully celebrated, and equally cared for. I refuse to be a Christian who speaks always with holy war rhetoric about an encroaching enemy horde that must be rallied against and defeated. I refuse to be a Christian who is generous with damnation and stingy with grace. And I refuse to be a Christian who can't see the image of God in people of every color, every religious tradition, every sexual orientation. Basically, you get the idea. But I refuse to be a Christian who sees the world in a hopeless spiral downward and can only condemn it or withdraw from it. And obviously, I think we have to wake up from the idea that revelation is anything more than an incredible act of imagination that John of Patmos had. We're not even sure if it was John the Apostle, because as I understand it, it was written down in the 4th century, not at the time of Christ. So, but there are many people in the United States today who think that we're in the end times, and so let's go for it. Let's destroy the world. Then I refuse to be a Christian devoid of the character of Jesus, his humility, his compassion, his smallness, his gentleness with people's wounds, his attention to the poor and the forgotten and the marginalized, his tolerance for religious hypocrisy, his intolerance for religious hypocrisy, his clear expression of the love of God. I refuse to be a Christian unless it means I live as a person of hospitality, of healing, of redemption, of justice, of expectation, defying grace, of counterintuitive love. These are non-negotiables. And he says, yes, it is much more difficult to say these days than it has ever been, but I still do say it. I'm still a Christian, but I refuse to be one without Jesus. So he pretty much summed up how the U.S. leading religion has been turned to the benefit of certain greedy and abusive political leaders. And the reason I'm saying this is because 53% of you said that you want political commentary on this YouTube channel. So to the extent you want political commentary, that was a political commentary. And we'll continue on with it. Any comments on Pavlovitz's letter, either Carl or Jerome. You don't have to take a position if you don't.
Well, I liked his letter, particularly when he was talking about seeing other people as the same as you and seeing the same love in them as you see in them through their eyes. That's what Jesus is all about.
Right.
And he was what would be, what Carl Jung would say, he would be fully individuated, in other words. He was,
Oh, yeah, he's definitely.
He is something that we're looking for, to shoot for.
Right.
At the same time, it's within us at the same time.
Right. It's his destiny.
Right. In other words, when we look at him, we're really seeing something that's reflected in us. And we really need to get in contact with us. And that's kind of what you're saying, like the football player, he's thinking inside, it's in us.
Okay, so Miles says here on the chat, I looked up super and it means beyond the limits, whereas super is greater, higher than. So man is in a super role to find the middle ground as being able to bridge God and earth and all mankind. It's something like that, but I think that it also means within. Super is outside and beyond our ken, and what Paul Vanderklay talks about woo, right? A lot of ideas about all religions are based on magic ideas, thinking that miracles are all magic. And why don't we have magic things happening from our religions today? And those miracles are something else. And I'm not really going to get into it in great detail here, but the remember Christ said that my kingdom is not of this world, meaning it's not of the physical world, it's of the inner world. And so let us take the revival of Lazarus as an example. That's a favorite one of mine. And in that case, did Christ bring Lazarus back to physical health? The answer is very likely no. However, when he went into the house to meet with Martha and Mary, I guess it was, who were Lazarus's sisters, he pointed out to them that Lazarus was still alive, and Lazarus was still alive within them, and that's the miracle. And that's the miracle that I've certainly experienced with the loss of my brother and my parents, because what I learned was that when they died, yes, they're no longer here physically, but they are with me spiritually every bit as much as they ever have been. Okay, let's see. I have 2 participants that raised their hands. Okay, let me see. Okay. Carl, you seem to have raised your hand.
Yeah. I had a comment on what you just said regarding Lazarus.
Right. Okay.
I agree with you. What you said, that he was still alive in his sisters, and our loved ones are still alive in us. That have passed. I do wonder. I feel like when I've been isolated from my unconscious, my health is not good.
Whoops. Oh. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm trying to deal with a technical problem here, and I seem to have knocked Jerome off. So, darn it. That's not good. This is because we're trying to work through 2 systems, the Zoom system and the YouTube system. And okay, so let me focus on your point, Carl, until Jerome comes back.
So I Lazarus, though he may not have been physically actually dead, I feel like health, like Dr. Jung said all healing is spiritual in nature.
Oh, what is spiritual?
I believe Dr. Jung said that. That all healing,
just say again what you said. I didn't hear what you said.
All healing is spiritual in nature.
Okay, yeah.
And just my own physical issues, I believe much of it is due to a dearth in connection with the unconscious, in connection with God.
Yeah, because really all of our healing, the doctors are just trying to set things up in such a way that you can heal yourself. Yeah, actually. I have to focus on sending Jerome an email quickly. Okay, so Jerome, I accidentally knocked you offline. Could you log back on? I don't know what I did. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me send him an email now, so hopefully he'll be able to. Let's see. Sorry, everyone. This technology sometimes gets the better of us. I just have to make sure I didn't knock Jerome off as a panelist. I think he should still be there, but let me just double check. Oh my God. It seems that what happened was I knocked him out entirely. So let me see if I can put him back in. Hold on a minute. Hello? Yeah. I can't talk to you right now. Sorry. Somebody calling from my business school, wanting money, no doubt. Let's see, Jerome. Okay, let me get him back in here, and then we can go on. How did that happen? Sometimes they've made this stuff a little bit too confusing for their own good. Oh boy. All right. Okay. Sorry, folks. I want to get Jerome back in here, and hopefully this will work. Okay, so Jerome, you should be back in the panel again. That was just a flub by Skip. I apologize for that. 2 people raised their hands. Now 3. Okay. Okay. And Miles, I've now got you back in, I think.
Yeah, I'm back. You knocked me off
Yeah.
from being one of the panelists, and I think
Right.
Miles had the same problem. Is Miles on as a panelist?
He's on now. Yeah, what happened?
Okay.
Yeah, what happened was, for some reason, Zoom is blocking some people. And so you have to get on the Zoom panel and then raise your hand. And then when I see you, I can approve you. But I thought I was approving you, Jerome. And what happened was I accidentally knocked you off. But
you disapproved.
Yeah. So anyway, all right, we're back to it now. Okay. So meanwhile, people let's see what's happening here. So Sean Smith says, yes. And language is magi. Art says, I think that some Christians are with what God is, but others are just wanted to say that they are Christians, but don't have the love of God in their hearts. Boy, that's for sure. And a lot of them don't even understand what Christianity is, because all these pastors who are preaching, you have to get ahead and the devil take the hindmost. That's not what Christ preached at all. And let's see, Carl said, I wonder how much of that is due to people's experience with their parents as children, as when we're very young, we project our image of God onto our parents. Very definitely, yeah. And people have an experience of God as being very severe and only loving under the condition that a tyrannical set of laws is followed. I'm sure that happens. And PC says God is good is only one half of the antinomy, right? And so that's the point. Okay, so here I'm going to say, I'm going to read a little something from Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology by Lawrence Yaffe. And Dr. Yaffe unfortunately died in 2003 at the age of 63, but he was the son of Agnella Yaffe, who pulled together Memory Streams Reflections for Dr. Jung. And so in this, he's quoting something that Dr. Jung said at the last appearance that he made in the United States, which was in 1937. And so at that point, he was 62 years old, and he was quite a respected psychologist at that time. He had many very wealthy and prominent patients by that time. And they had a dinner for him at the Plaza Hotel in New York, believe it or not. And this was long before the current ownership. and so he got pushed along because what happened was there had been a lecture earlier, and it had been a disaster in the sense of live presentations often being disasters if you have to rely on technology, such as right now what's happened to us in this conversation. And so here's what Dr. Yaffe said. Our witness reports that Jung's humbling experience might have influenced his remarks. If so, we owe a debt of gratitude to that inept projectionist, for a more moving statement of Jung's essential vision has not come down to us. Here, in part, is what Jung said. Quote, Jesus, was a boy born of an unmarried mother. Such a boy is called illegitimate, and there is a prejudice which puts him at a great disadvantage. He suffers from a terrible feeling of inferiority for which he is certain to have had to compensate. Hence the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, in which the kingdom was offered to him. Here he met his worst enemy, the power devil. But he was able to see that and to refuse. He said, "My kingdom is not of this world," but kingdom it was all the same. And you remember that strange incident, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The utter failure came at the crucifixion in the tragic words, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" If you want to understand the full tragedy of those words, you must realize what they meant. Christ saw that his whole life, devoted to the truth according to his best conviction, had been a terrible illusion. He had lived it to the full, absolutely sincerely. He had made his honest experiment, but it was nevertheless a compensation. But because he had lived so fully and devotedly, he won through to the resurrection body. We must all do just what Christ did. We must make our experiment. We must make mistakes. We must live out our own vision of life, and there will be error. If you avoid error, you do not live. In a sense, even it may be said that every life is a mistake, for no one has found the truth. When we live like this, we know Christ as a brother, and God indeed becomes man. This sounds like a terrible blasphemy, but not so, for then only can we understand Christ as he would want to be understood, as a fellow man. Then only does God become man in ourselves. This sounds like religion, but it is not. I am speaking just as a philosopher. People sometimes call me a religious leader. I am not that. I attempt only to understand. And so the last thing I would say to each of you, my friends, is carry through your life as well as you can, even if it is based on error, because life has to be undone, and one often gets to truth through error. Then, like Christ, you will have accomplished your experiment. So be human, seek understanding, seek insight, and make your hypothesis, your philosophy of life. Then we may recognize the spirit alive in the unconscious of every individual. Then we become brothers of Christ. In the margin, I wrote next to the following words. This is the key. Christ saw that his whole life, devoted to the truth according to his best conviction, had been a terrible illusion. He had lived it to the full, absolutely sincerely. He had made his honest experiment, but it was nevertheless a compensation. Okay, so the point is that we all have a destiny, and one of the objectives of individuation is to understand our destiny and to live it fully. And this is what they're trying to say. So I'm going to put this up here again. And so the next point is incarnation equals integration. And so what it means is that most religions have sort of written the Holy Ghost out of the world one way or another, but we need to see that the Holy Ghost means that we accept the indications that come our way from our unconscious, and that is integration, and it probably takes some maturity before we can live with that. And then salvation is individuation. In other words, realizing that you've paid attention to the self in terms of what you were intended to be. We're all intended to be something specific based on where we're born, who our parents are, all kinds of other factors, and that's our destiny. And if you can understand your destiny and live your destiny, then you're going to have no problem with meaning. But if you don't live that destiny, then you will have. And so individuation means being conscious, getting yourself conscious of what your destiny is based on who you are and where you are and what you're doing. And if you achieve that, then you will be saved, okay? And so the point is that we live in two worlds, and they are both this one. One world is the physical world, and that's where all the atheists and the agnostics have gone over the cliff on spirituality, because they haven't understood that the spiritual part of our life isn't in the physical world. It's in the unconscious. It's in the psyche. And all of us have to go through what Dr. Jung called the divine drama. So in the next few days, and it's probably going to take about 2 weeks, I'm going to read 2 books by Edward Edinger. One is, let me take this down here. One is The Christian Archetype, a Jungian commentary on the life of Christ. And the other is The Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament. And so the point is that these stories of early Jews and of early Christians and so on are not ancient stories. These are stories that are about us today, every person, that we all face the kinds of issues that did come up during the Bible and during the development of the Bible. And so the reason the Bible is the most sold book in the world is because those stories have been refined and refined and refined over millennia, and they are about us. And so when people start talking about a new religion, we have to stop thinking that way, okay? Dr. Jung wasn't thinking that there would be a new religion, and he didn't want people to think that way. He wanted to point out to us that all religions are true, okay? They're psychic truths. They're all stories that have been brought up and refined over centuries and centuries. And yes, we have to have the great task. The great task is to reconstitute religious tradition in a way that modern man can understand it. But we can't create a new religion, which is what John Vervaeke has been trying to do. And apparently he's created a website in which people can put different religious traditions into his website, and somehow he imagines that a new religion can be developed out of that, and that is a rationalist wet dream. And this is what happens when you try to do that. Okay, so this is the Apostle Luke. In 1502, one of the alchemists drew a picture that included the various elements that the Apostle Luke brought into the picture. And there's another one. So that's Luke, and I'm going to give you John. Let's see. All right. So here's John. And so this is by Sebastian Brandt in 1502. And he was trying to pull all the elements of the Apostle John into one image. And it's rather difficult. And as soon as I heard Dr. Vervaeke start talking about creating a new religion based on putting together Wikipedia posts, that's what came to mind. That's what you'll get. And nobody's going to follow a religion like that. And so what got interesting today was in the conversation between Alistair McGrath and Brent Weinstein. Weinstein was talking about the evolution of whatever things. And he's a biologist, and his wife is a biologist, apparently. And he makes the point that the psyche has to evolve exactly like other parts of our body. And so when we cut ourselves off from our religious tradition, which is a religious tradition built up over millennia, and you're born into it, whatever your faith tradition, whatever belief system you're brought into, it's a part of you, whether you accept it or not. And when you cut yourself off from that, it's like cutting off your arm. And you might get an artificial arm, but if you get an artificial arm, it's going to look like one of these pictures of John and Luke. It's not going to look like your actual evolved arm. And this is why it's wrong-headed to think that we're going to create a new religion. What we have to do is turn people back toward the truth that's in the religions that we have on the planet right now. Okay, that's my premise anyway.
Well, I would think it's, it's the roots. You're cut off from your roots and your
Sure.
identity. And
Right.
as Jung said, those are deep, deep channels that have been carved that have made you survive over the centuries with your whole heritage.
Right.
And the collective unconscious is what he's talking about. This is what we're dealing with. And we need to get back to the roots and reestablish that communication.
Right. So that's precisely what is going. What's happening is people are trying to evolve us, and we're trying to evolve. Everybody who's on television or on YouTube is trying to get somebody to pay attention to them, right? And so when you listen to this cacophony of political stuff on the cable channels, for example, it's the same over and over and over again. And what they're trying to do is to set in your mind and in the unconscious of the country that their way is the right way. And what we need to start understanding is that it's not their way that is the right way, it's our way. And each of us needs to make our own decisions about what's right and wrong.
And I also thought, I listened to that interview, and it was, I thought it was fascinating that he was talking about to Weinstein, that he said, you're trying to create a new religion. And then he says, what happens with that is you end up being a totalitarianism. I can't say that word.
That's what McGrath said.
To Weinstein. He was saying you can't do that because it'll just end up being so that's why we need to get back. Each religion has its strong points. And what Jung was saying is we need to reinterpret it and revivify those symbols. The symbols is what causes the feeling and the numinous feeling, and you do feel in contact.
We have to, we have to turn away from first of all, the people that say religions are wrong, because they're not wrong. Okay, they're evolved methods of dealing with the unconscious. I agree that there are both negative and positive things in the unconscious. And so they're naturally evolved methods of dealing with those things, just as I was talking about Lazarus earlier. Okay, so what are religions? They were naturally evolved methods of psychotherapy, basically. Okay, and that when I said that to Paul Vanderklay a while back, he was startled because he had never thought of it that way. But really, these are naturally evolved ways of dealing with this. And for example, dealing with the death of Lazarus, if you will. And so it's a problem. It's a huge problem. And so the great task is to for everyone to turn around and start reanalyzing religious tradition in terms of modern categories of understanding. And I got into a battle royal one time when my daughter, who's now in her 40s, when she was 15, I was seeing a video of the story of about the story of Lazarus, and basically, they said something like this, and she got furious. She had fallen in with fundamentalists, and she said, "No, it's not like that. This is the way it is. It was a miracle." And so she wanted to believe in the magic side of it. And it's not the magic side of it. That's the point. It's not supernatural, it's supranatural. And we have to somehow find ways among American and all people in the world to go back and do this reevaluation now of these religions and see how, first of all, how true they are and how true they still are, and see how, how they need to evolve in order to fill our needs. Because when people fell away from Christianity after, from the 19th century on, and certainly earlier than that, but especially from the 19th century on, and we did develop so many atheists and agnostics, it's because we didn't understand these fundamental things. And I admit that I'm a part of it because I didn't understand this fundamental point about supernatural versus supernatural until this morning. And I've been at it for 32 years. So it's not easy stuff. It's really not. And I had this same experience that Jordan Peterson had when he said, he found Ion terrifying. I guess I must have found Ion terrifying at one point in my life because I said, Christ as a symbol of the self. Come on, are you talking about the Son of God? But I was thinking in the way that I had been taught in my upbringing about Jesus as the Son of God, in a supernatural sense. And it's actually in a supernatural sense that we need to think about it. And I hope I clarified that for Miles, because he was asking about the difference between super and supra. Any further comments? Carl, you backed away from the screen. Are you?
Excuse me. No, that's not why.
I had this. I'll have to tell this group. I looked at John Vervaeke's number 35 in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and I've learned that when something is happening to me, I should pay attention to what comes to my mind. Okay, and the two things that came to my mind while I was watching that. The first one was Paul Simon's song Kodachrome, which begins with the line, "When I think of all the crap I learned in high school, I can't believe it's a wonder I can think at all." Because Vervaeke is so deeply into slicing and dicing everything that he possibly can. And so that was the first thing that came to my mind. The next thing that came to my mind was I was on the exercycle at the gym, and I had this vision of a silver cross coming into my hand so that I could hold it between me and the screen. And realizing that these rational approaches, to include so many religious figures, theologians who've been sucked into the rationality over the last 500 years. I guess if they did it as self-defense because they had to defend their religions against people that were starting to ask questions even 500 years ago. And so they got sucked into this rational explanation of religions, and they sort of lost the meaning themselves when they did that. So anyway.
So are you saying that he's a vampire?
Yeah, I'm saying that the rationalists are sucking the blood out of religion, to include the theologians who are rationalists.
So the reaction is that, keep away from that stuff coming at you from Vervaeke, in other words, because it's just, it's not going to amount to anything. It's not the right direction or the right track.
It's not helpful.
Yeah.
Not at all. In other
words, where does this get us, and how does this help people, human beings, live in our society today? How can we help them, live today? And we can reinterpret the religious symbols, and we can use Jung to do it. Jung is kind of a vehicle.
Sure. He's a signpost for, I could imagine 1,000 PhD theses just on Christianity alone, maybe more, maybe 10,000 PhD theses that go back and rethink everything in Christianity from the point of view of psychology and from the point of view of modern categories of understanding.
Yeah,
assuming that it's all evolutionarily developed.
Yeah, he provides the language that we can understand. If you get into it, you have to get into and read. And if you look at each of the mileposts or points on the individuation process, it starts to make sense in terms of what your experience is.
Right.
And so when you do have a numinous experience in reaction to say, hey, this is, this is great.
Right. Let's see, there's a couple of comments here. Let's see. Fed Undus says, most spiritual traditions seem to be techniques in overcoming the ego. So even though I'm secular, I can see much value in metaphors often pre-chastised as rank mysticism. What the rationalists have all kinds of ways to diss religion. No doubt. And we have to learn to separate the wheat from the chaff, because these are issues, the issues that Abraham and Moses were facing 3,000 years ago are still the same issues that we are facing today, each one of us. And the reason that the Bible amounts to truth is because of that fact. It's not because they said so 3,000 years ago. Who cares? What do you remember that happened last week, right? But anyway, Sean
but these are archetypal energies that repeat themselves over the eons, as Jung said. And I mean, they're going to repeat themselves unless we take some action and understand what they are, or we just repeat history over and over again, and it's a never-ending story.
Right. Okay, so I have here Jung's Red Book for Our Time. This happens to be the first essay in volume 1, and it's by Thomas Arst, who's one of the editors of the series. And I'll just give you a short excerpt from what he said. The spirit is waiting in the collective unconscious for recognition, for integration into the collective consciousness of our postmodern times. Today, the spirit is knocking at our door, or as Jung put it, the primordial essence is alive. Many pathologies of our age emerge from the lack of having an alchemical vessel to integrate these archetypal spiritual energies into the socio-cultural context. If the individual or society denies these energies the chance for expression, they will turn to confusion, destruction, and violence. Mercurius Duplex. It was alchemy that found the adequate expression for this, good with the good and bad with the bad. For the time being, though, it remains a mystery how the oversaturated, overaged, and overregulated societies of the West, run by disoriented and unimaginative guardians of the status quo in politics, media, and business, should approach this monumental challenge. We are devoid of any vision for the future. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity, lamented William Butler Yeats during Jung's day. Meanwhile, much would be gained if the planetary turbulences of postmodernity could be interpreted as a pregnant phase of initiation, as a rite of passage. In this sense, future generations would be inclined retrospectively to understand our postmodern era as a phase of negredo, as a time of collective disorientation and confusion, with its attitude toward the world manically oscillating between a Baroque lust for life and an apocalyptic foreboding of death. From Jung's perspective, it is important, though, to face the insecurity and abyss of modern life and to accept our spiritual nakedness, as well as the obvious dissolution of traditional belief systems, and openness to the psyche so that its intimations can be consciously realized is crucial too. Further, we have to learn how to deal with existential insecurity, uncertainty, and ambivalence, because at the center of anxiety, something may want to speak to us. If we are in a state of darkness, it is a divine darkness. If we feel ourselves to be stuck in the state of void, it is a divine void. In a similar point of view, German philosopher Leopold Ziegler considers the state of Western, forgetting of being, a gestalt of a divine being in abscondus. Within the metaphysical loneliness of modern consciousness, Jung detects a divine providence, or rather an occasion for a renewed experience of spirituality, especially as the living spirit attempts to resurrect from the ruins of the Christian edifice of beliefs. In this sense, the deconstruction frenzy of the 20th century would be understandable, as Richard Tarnas has pointed out. The 20th century's massive and radical breakdown of so many structures, cultural, philosophical, scientific, religious, moral, artistic, social, economic, political, atomic, ecological, all this suggests a necessary deconstruction prior to a new birth. If Tarnas has it right, coming generations hopefully might perhaps look back one day also on a phase of rubedo, the emergence of a new post-Christian spirituality. Well, my cut on this, after thinking about it a couple of years down from when I read this essay into into the YouTube channel, and you can find the whole essay, which is 35 pages long, on the homepage of the YouTube channel under Jung's Red Book for Our Time. The conclusion I've come to is that we have to realize that the right answer is going to be not to throw away our evolution. In other words, not cut off our arm so that we can have an artificial arm. It's to go back and look at what we had, which we accidentally threw away because we didn't know what we were doing, but now now we know something, and so now we can go back and see what it is that we threw away, and maybe we ought to revivify it. And maybe that's the revivification of the king. I'm not convinced that there's going to be a new religion, as I've indicated. Carl, do you have thoughts of this?
Nothing in particular.
Okay.
As far as religions go, I feel myself drawn to the three of them. And I wonder, or maybe more even. So what do you think about that? I grew up in a Christian society and tradition, but...
Well, Thomas More wrote a book called A Religion of One's Own. And it seems to me that we have to cobble something together, because there's a huge urge to have something spiritual in our lives. It's actually moved into the gyms now, among other places. For example, there are all these yoga teachers in gyms all over the country. They're yoga teachers in Nebraska. And what are they doing? They're teaching Hinduism, basically. And my wife and I wanted, for physical reasons, to go take a little yin yoga, which is a very low impact yoga. And so we started going to this class. It so happened that it was at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. And basically it was a substitute worship service. And basically I don't know whether the teachers actually realize what they're doing, whether they actually realize that they're teaching a Hindu technique, but they may not. But it's fulfilling. It's obviously fulfilling that 11 o'clock Sunday morning need. And of course, I live with a Buddhist teacher, and every Monday at noon, I'm at a Buddhist meditation class, and so I've been around a lot of different religions over my lifetime. You may remember my friend Lana. This is my painting. This is the painting I did of her.
That's beautiful.
Just completed it over the weekend.
Oh, looks good. Hold it up again. I want to see it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Very nice.
Yeah. And, we're going around the world treating one another badly in an inappropriate way, because, for example, I've been in Saudi Arabia 23 times since 2002. So all those times have been since 9/11. And one thing I can say unequivocally is that the Muslims of Saudi Arabia have a very strong family life, much stronger than we see in the United States today. And, so I think that there are things that we can draw from in all the world's religions. I mean, several people have said, we should pray 4 times a day. I saw that recently. I forget who said that, but, obviously the Muslims pray 5 times a day. And, it isn't that our religions are perfect. Okay, we have to we have to reevaluate them in terms of modern categories of understanding, because the horrific stuff that goes on in Exodus and Deuteronomy, that's not appropriate for the modern world, obviously. But it's also not appropriate for Jews or for Muslims. And so all of us have to go back and reevaluate and rethink these things. And, what could be wrong with praying 4 or 5 times a day? I mean, I've experienced it in Saudi Arabia, where you'll be in the middle of a business meeting or a dinner, and all of a sudden they say, "Oh, it's time for prayer," and everything stops, and the businessmen go away, and they come back a half hour later having prayed. And if you happen to be in a restaurant, they shut the shutters, and you're sitting there at your table in the dark, because you're not supposed to be doing anything during those times. But, some of it is a little bit over the top. I mean, for example, shutting restaurant guests in behind the shutters and locking the doors is not necessarily the best idea, but the idea of praying, for example, what's wrong with that? And certainly in Buddhism, we meditate and meditation does put you in contact with yourself, especially if you learn how to do it properly. And that's the main reason that I go to that meditation group, not because I want to become a Buddhist. If I wanted to do that, I just, roll over in bed because my wife is right there. but I go for the meditation period as a way of connecting me up with myself. And I think that that's useful. I hope anyway. Let's see. Sean says, instead of considering a continuous transition from one value of a quantity to another, from one position to another, or speaking generally from one determination of a concept or another to another, one considers in the first place a transition through a finite number of intervals, and then allows the number of these intervals to increase so that the distances of 2 successive points of division all decrease infinitely. I think this is a more logos way of describing alchemy. The quote was from Bernhard Riemann, referencing Newton, who was an alchemist. I don't have anything to add to that. I think we can, the issue, of course, until probably the 20th century primarily, is that, we never had contact with other parts of the world, really, except for very occasional people, very few people. There was nobody in the 19th century that went to Saudi Arabia from the United States 23 times. No way. Okay. And so our understanding of different cultures is very new. It's really from the Jet Age. And now that we have been exposed to them and have been exposed to the fact that we're all on the same planet, it's the same leaky boat. And we really need to figure out how we're going to get along, because otherwise we can just destroy ourselves. That, we have that capability too, and that's Dr. Jung's point. So Rocket King says, being introduced to the archetypes was indeed a game changer for me personally. The notion that each human vessel houses the divine pantheons brings the numinous into a much more tangible reach. Yes, very definitely. And Grenade says, U.S. is a very individualistic culture. Family is not as strong. For example, if you live with your mom and dad at age 26, you are looked down on. I kind of agree with it, though. Also necessary for individuation. Well, okay, but Dr. Jung was in favor of individuals, and let me just read an important paragraph from this book, Man and His Symbols, and this is the hardbound copy. And if you don't have the hardbound copy, I urge you to get it. There is an electronic copy of it in our Dropbox, but for example, let's see, you can see that the pages are in color in the hardbound copy. And unfortunately, the paperback version is all black and white, and they seem to have left out some of the key images. So these hardbound copies are available out on Amazon on used books. I actually bought 3 of them for $10 a few years ago, and I occasionally gift them to someone. But this is the critical passage from Dr. Jung. It's on page 101 of the hardbound copy under a heading which is Healing the Split. As any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs to face the present condition of the world. Okay, so the point is we all have to grow up and take responsibility for what's happening around us and how we can change it. And I don't know. Yes, go ahead.
So I don't know, I can't turn on my camera, but you can hear me okay, I gather.
Yeah, let me see if I can turn on your camera. Okay, I don't seem to have a way.
Okay, it's all right if you can hear me. So anyway, curiously, I just recently discovered a gentleman, Dr. Pierce Robinson, professor at the University of Sheffield in England, chair of politics, society, and political journalism. And he talks a lot about propaganda. And propaganda is actually one of the fathers of modern propaganda in the West, the United States, and in particular, is Edward Bernays, who was a nephew of Sigmund Freud.
Huh.
So very much knowledgeable about the psychology of humans. And propaganda is the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses. And it is an important element in democratic society. That was a quote of Edward Bernays. And then because of the Germans in World War I giving propaganda a bad name, because up till World War I, before the Germans were using it, actually propaganda was considered a good word. So Edward Bernays said, well, let's call it public relations instead.
Yeah.
And so it's this manipulation of persuasion that violates rational free will. And deception is just one element of propaganda, but not the only one.
Sure.
So there's other ways to coerce people to do things,
We have to remember that every one of us is being faced with propaganda practically in our constant waking life. Okay, every time you turn on the television or a YouTube channel, including this one, you're hearing somebody's point of view. And it's not only the advertisers that are propagandizing, it's also the people who are making the programs that we want to watch. And they have a certain purpose in what they're teaching us or telling us. And, certainly I have such a purpose. I apologize for it, but nonetheless,
this is where
we're here.
What I wanted to point out is the concept of Jung saying that it's the supranatural, that it's you go within each of ourselves in this process of individuation.
Right.
That is how we will, or if we are successful, counter the propaganda, the manipulation, the coercion. And in a sense, a lot of these institutions of theology are propaganda focused in a way, because if we're going to solve these world existential issues, we have to be able to discern what is truth, especially when we have all these people who are propagandizing things and manipulating us. So right. I just want to bring that to the table. And it's so critical for people to understand that there's this individuation that we have to do.
Right, where we each individually have to make our own judgments about things and not rely on somebody else to take care of it for us. Okay, and so that's the issue.
But I will also, though, refute or just state that I don't totally agree with what you previously said about, John Vervaeke not having anything for us, because I understand where you're coming from insofar as there's an awful lot of verbiage to try to decipher, for him to get around to basically, saying relevance realization is individuation, and he I don't know that he could summarize that simply, but it is just that simple. Anyway, I just wanted to say, I find that, your image of don't exclude anybody is always an important one, because
I mean, that's fair.
There's little pieces that you get from them,
Right. And I do agree. Okay. I do agree that both Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke, make some good points. My issue with Vervaeke is mainly that, okay, he's got this convoluted idea about how he's getting to a certain point, and in life, you're never going to go through that rational process. There's no way. You don't have time. You have to rely on your unconscious to tell you what the right answer is. And either, your unconscious was paying close attention in class or it wasn't. But
yeah, I agree. Because here's for an example. I was listening to Paul Vanderklay talking to a fellow, his name's JP from France. And I just thought I have to just write a few of the words they used within a very short time period. These were the words that were being used: colonization, the emancipation perspective, being a capabilist, panpsychism, metaphysics, epistemology, axiology. If everybody has to learn all this,
well, you have to carry a dictionary with you, or be very quick with your Wikipedia dictionary.
Yeah,
and when that stuff comes up, it just reminds me of Paul Simon's Kodachrome again. You have to think for yourself, right? And we have to revivify the spiritual life in some way. It is being done in various ways. Okay, it's being done in the gyms and the yoga classes. It's being done in all kinds of experiments with Buddhism and what have you, or even Protestants who are now experimenting with Orthodox Christianity because of Jonathan Pajot. Okay, that's all great, because that's a part of this. This is, and so it just seems to me that it'd be good if we're conscious of what it is we're doing. Right? and
Yeah, and that's because the world's going to pot around us, and we do need to come together, as you're always saying. And until we sort of say, okay, let's keep it simple, stupid, kind of the KISS principle, we will be doing, because we're just be talking ourselves to the end of time.
Right. And so my simple point is, instead of having religions that are back to back, we need them to turn face to face. And some people are doing that, and there's been an ecumenical movement throughout the world in various religions for decades, but I don't know that it's really taken very much. I mean, every time I hear Paul talk, he's dissing somebody. He's dissing some religion, where today was dissing Judaism and Islam. And, we have to find a way to stop thinking that way and start facing the evolution of the rest of the world. All of humanity evolved in this way, and we all did it at about the same time. I mean, Buddha and Christ are virtual contemporaries, and it's not that they had a particular monopoly on wisdom. There was already wisdom all over the world. I mean, I looked it up one time on 500 BC, which is the time of the Buddha, and at 500 BC, there were about 100 million human beings on the planet, about 100 million. And, all of those, all those people are ancestors to any of us. Okay. Some of our ancestors were among those 100 million people at that time. And they may not have been Jews at that time, or they may not have been Christians, and certainly there weren't any Muslims at that time. And so what we need to do is find all the wisdom of the world and find out what works and what doesn't work. But that doesn't mean we throw all of the wisdom out from any given faith tradition, okay? Because the evolution of those faith traditions is true, okay? Essentially, that's Dr. Jung's message. It's interesting, the cycles. I came across in our advanced class, I was reading from this book, the Mysterium Lectures, and I came across this quote about the death of Pan. And Pan, of course, was a god in early Greek mythology. And the rumor of the death of Pan, very much like the God is Dead from Nietzsche, was recorded in Plutarch in his essay called The Obsolescence of Oracles. And so let me just read that to you, where Plutarch records the following story he had heard directly from a participant. Quote, he said that once upon a time, in making a voyage to Italy, he embarked on a ship carrying freight and many passengers. It was already evening when, near Echinatus Islands, the wind dropped and the ship drifted near Paxi. Almost everybody was awake, and a good many had not finished their after-dinner wine. Suddenly, from the island of Paxi, was heard the voice of someone loudly calling Thomas, so that all were amazed. Thomas was an Egyptian pilot, not known by name even to many on board. Twice he was called and made no reply, but the third time he answered, and the caller, raising his voice, said, "When you come opposite to Palodes, announce that Great Pan is dead." On hearing this, all were astounded and reasoned among themselves whether it would be better to carry out the order or to refuse to meddle and let the matter go. Under the circumstances, Thomas made up his mind that if there should be a breeze, he would sail past and keep quiet, but with no wind and a smooth sea about the place, he would announce that what he had heard. So when he came opposite Palodes, and there was neither wind nor wave, Thomas from the stern, looking toward the land, said the words he had heard, "Great Pan is dead." Even before he had finished, there was a great cry of lamentation, not of one person, but of many, mingled with exclamations of amazement. As many persons were on the vessel, the story was soon spread abroad in Rome, and Thomas was sent for by Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius became so convinced of the truth of the story that he caused an inquiry and investigation to be made about Pan. So then he talks about Nietzsche, and he says, we have the modern equivalent of that event, and our modern Thomas, the pilot, is Nietzsche. Let me read you something of what he has to say. He doesn't tell us this on his own authority. The unconscious tells him to tell us. That's my reading of it. It's from Thus Spake Zarathustra. At the beginning of Nietzsche's account, Zarathustra descends from his mountain retreat and is going to go among men to preach his new message. On his way down, going through the forest, he encounters an ascetic hermit, a saint. Quote, "And what is the saint doing in the forest?" asked Zarathustra. The saint answered, "I make songs and sing them. And when I make songs, I laugh, cry, and hum. Thus I praise God. With singing, crying, laughing, and humming, I praise the God who is my God." When Zarathustra had heard these words, he bade the saint farewell and said, "Let me go quickly, lest I take something from you." And thus he separated, and the old man and the old one and the man laughing as two boys laugh. But when Zarathustra was alone, he spoke thus to his heart. Could it be possible this old saint in the forest has not yet heard anything of this, that God is dead? And then later on, Zarathustra encounters what he calls the ugliest man, a very disgusting creature who represents the repressed, neglected, disregarded shadow aspect of humanity. And the ugliest man said this, "Zarathustra, Zarathustra, guess my riddle. Speak, speak. What is the revenge against the witness?" That's his riddle, and Zarathustra responds to the ugliest man. "I recognize you well," he said in a voice of bronze. "You are the murderer of God. You could not bear him who saw you, who always saw you through and through, you ugliest man. You took revenge on this witness." So that's killing the messenger, I guess. So I guess I should watch out. Any comments? Let's go to comments again.
Well, it seems to me it's kind of like something comes to confront you and we take turn and run from it.
Right.
And what we need to do is to get a little more courage and face that, maybe a little at a time, not to overwhelm yourself.
Right.
But to do that, I also wanted to address something that Carl mentioned back a ways about the three religions he was interested in. You had a tree that you showed on one of your sites that showed a whole bunch of practices that people do. And yet there's a whole menu of selections for this tree of different practices, religious practices, chanting, also, what do they call prayer and yoga. And do you remember that tree that you had?
Carl?
Your wife gave you the tree.
Talking to you, Skip.
Oh, the tree I had.
Yeah, your tree, not this tree.
I beg your pardon. I thought you had addressed yourself to Carl.
Yeah, I was just addressing. He was talking about he had 3 different religions he was interested in, and I was thinking of the tree that your wife that you gave you, and it had a whole bunch of different practices that you could look at that see what I would just say see what resonates with you in particular.
Right.
Because different people resonate with different types of practices.
Yep. It so happens that I do have it, Jerome, and so I'm going to share it with you.
Okay.
Here it is. The impossible takes just a little bit longer. Would you like to talk through that?
If I could see it. It says creation process practices, movement practices, stillness practices, activist practices, generative practices, ritual and cyclical practices, and relational practices. In other words, and if you look at the different categories, you can see all sorts of things. Vision quest, pilgrimages to religious sites. Sometimes you can have a religious experience just by getting into those sites that are really infused with religious energy, and you can really have some numinous experiences. You've got all sorts of centering. Prayer is something that I think the Episcopal and the Catholics are coming up. They're getting more into that centering prayer. There's also silence, meditation, and stillness practices. You could, if you like movement, there's Tai Chi, martial arts. Just look at all these things that are on this tree. Right. And then creative, you can do art. I know Skip just showed us a piece of art he was doing. I do art.
Right.
Jungian, they have sand play, sand mandala, sand, I can't ever say that word, mandala or mandala.
Mandala.
Yeah. And so, look at all these choices that you have and just find something that resonates. The idea is you express, when you do artistic work or still your mind, you're quieting down your logos side.
Yeah.
You're allowing your eros side to emerge. And the best way to do that is to take some action and paint something, move, get back in touch with your body. I mean, that's, I really like this tree.
Right.
That's nice.
And I found a new meditation technique, which is partially thanks to you, Jerome, which was that you were getting into calligraphy, and I'm thinking of also getting one of the red books that we learned about recently. And what we're talking about is a blank red book that's going to be available for sale. And Dr. Jung, when he did his red book, the one that's here over my shoulder, he wrote it out as a illuminated text, like a medieval manuscript. And so if you're going to spend that kind of money on a handmade book, you want to make it count. And so you were talking about doing calligraphy, and so I was thinking about taking a course in calligraphy to prepare myself to do the same thing. And instead, I bought a book and I started to work with the book, and I found it's not as difficult as it seems. at first, so I've been at it for a week. But my wife came back and looked at it. She said, "Wow, you can do calligraphy."
Well, yeah, I can copy these little letters pretty good.
Right.
It does take talent, but also I also found, like, when each page of the red book starts with a square with a letter in it.
Right.
And you can use your pens and different color ink.
Sure.
To just paint that. Actually, you're actually painting with your pen.
Right. And what I discovered today, because I'm thinking of getting a new device for my presentation, I was looking at an iPad, a new iPad Pro, 12.9-inch iPad Pro, and there's a software on it called Procreate, and if you take the Apple Pen and work with Procreate, one of the choices that they have in it is calligraphy, and you can use all kinds of different calligraphy. So you can actually get this 12.5-inch or 12.9-inch blank sheet, and you can actually practice it, and you can do it in different colors and so on. So it may be that it becomes a substitute for actually having paper to do it with. Although I'm not saying that I wouldn't also do the red book too, but in terms of practicing and learning, it's a terrific thing, it seems. So I've learned all about those things this week.
Yeah, great.
And so Marie asked whether I was reading from Thus Spake Zarathustra, and the answer was yes. And Sean says, and whoever does not want to die of thirst among men must learn to drink out of all cups, and whoever would stay clean among men must know how to wash even the dirty water. And that quote is from Zarathustra, he said. And he says, I like it because the first part of it is about reciprocity, and the later part about leadership with toxic environments, which is the real alchemy of attitude. Right. And Marie says, pen, pineapple, apple, pen. I'm not sure what you're saying there, Marie. She says she used to study calligraphy. And but I'm not quite sure what your point is about pen, pineapple, apple, pen, Marie. Okay. So I think I've covered, there's one more thing that I wanted to cover. And some of you have heard it before, but this is about maturity. And a lot of what we're talking about in individuation is about maturity. And, you're the culmination of all your ancestors. And so there's a message in this, and this is in Donald Kalschit's book, The Trauma and the Soul. And he's quoting from John Tarrant, whose beautiful book, The Light Inside the Dark, circles and circles around this difficult reality and puts it like this, quote, we see a child running between trees in twilight with his friend. He ignores the call to dinner, cannot hear anything, cannot see anything but the sound and illumination of his happiness. While we know, we have seen the charts, that he will die of leukemia. At such a moment, we can find unbearable the juxtaposition of innocence and suffering to come, the thought that the happiness in question is entirely illusory. It's hard to have the grand view of the angel at the same time as we have the intimate view of the boy who runs and wants to run and run forever. We have to acknowledge that the child was happy, looking forward to a future that would not be his. We have to say that life itself is beautiful before we talk about outcomes. Everything we taste is snatched from death. Our responsibility is to taste it completely. We betray the angel's view because we must. Those we love die, yet we must eat, we must sing, we must love them anyway. That is our job. We may have the angel's view as well as the child's, but not instead of it. When we stop singing, it is our time, and we too go into the dark. And I just thought that was a very moving piece. And in terms of the eternal moment, I think I read this last week, but it does bear repeating for anybody who hasn't heard this. This is paragraph 330 from Mysterium Conjunctionis, and we can call it the eternal moment. The great thing is now and here. This is the eternal moment. And if you do not realize it, you have missed the best part of life. And you have missed the realization that you were once the carrier of a life contained between the poles of unimaginable future and an unimaginably remote past. Millions of years and untold millions of ancestors have worked up to this moment, and you are the fulfillment of this moment. Anything that is past is no longer reality. Anything we will be is not yet reality. Reality is now. To look at life as a mere preparation for things to come is as if you could not enjoy your meal while it is hot. That is the disease, really, of our time. Everybody is chiefly concerned about the future. One admits that now things are very bad, so all the more one tries to jump out of them, and therefore they never improve. One should take each moment as the eternal moment, as if nothing were ever going to change, not anticipating a faraway future. For the future always grows out of that which is, and it cannot be sound if it grows in a morbid soil. If we are morbid and don't feel this here and now, then we naturally will build up a sickly future. We have seen that in actual historical conditions, things are so bad at present because everybody lived in anticipation of something to come. One always expected the golden age, so things got worse and worse. Therefore, in psychology, in the life of the individual, it is of the greatest importance that we never think of it as merely now with the hope of something coming in the future. You can be sure it will never come when you think like that. You must live life in such a spirit that you make in every moment the best of all possibilities. And so I think that that's a pretty profound quote from Dr. Jung, and that's from Mysterium Conjunctionis. And the reason I read it again is because most people probably won't endeavor to read it, Mysterium Conjunctionis, but that is a gem from that book.
Well, yeah, I think that's probably a good gem, actually. And as I mentioned one time before, is, if you make a decision and just change your attitude about this based on just what you just read, you can change. It's just a decision. Change your attitude. Hey, this is it, man, and let's move forward.
We gotta, as I've quipped before, the best way to find a meaning to life is to get one.
That's it.
And, have a child. That'll give you meaning to life for about 20 years. And if possible, stay with your spouse. What I learned by changing my spouse is that you never get rid of the relatives of your former spouse, because they're always there at weddings and funerals and so on. And so, what's the point of trying to change? I didn't follow my own advice, but I didn't know what I know today. I'm sadder but wiser, but I'm happy. Okay.
Yeah, me too. I'm sadder but wiser.
Right. Okay. All right, so we're going to call this meeting to an end. I'll see you all next week. And we had a terrific turnout tonight. At one point, we had more than 30 people simultaneously watching, which is more than I think I've ever seen before. And that means that during the 2-hour period, typically we've had more than 100 people that have been watching live. And so that's very impressive to me. And you know, we've been getting quite a number of people who have come back and watched the replays. So that's also very exciting. And Opal Sparkles says, I know, crazy video. Thank you. Okay. So anyway, something's happening. I don't know what, but it's nice that folks are coming and listening. And I hope everybody takes the eternal moment. And thank you all for spending this eternal moment with us tonight. Jerome, I'm going to test that PowerPoint that you sent me and see if I can put it on Zoom, and I'll let you know.
Okay, great.
All right, probably tomorrow. It should be fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for joining us tonight, Carl. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Carl.
And apologies to all my regular panelists who I didn't get a notice out to.
Great meeting you, Jerome.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Things happen, so take care now.